But he didn't know what else Jewishness was, really. He didn't want me to marry a non-Jewish woman. Hello again, nice to see you. It's nice of you to say so. Yep. Because he saw in that mural what is inside his head.
Добрый вечер. Во-первых, господин Джейкобсон, для нас это огромная честь. Мы договорили тут только что с нашими друзьями, что одна из главных привилегий работы в издательском деле – это видеть время от времени людей с обложки возле себя. И я надеюсь, что это будет не только лицезрение, что сегодня господин Джейкобсон будет говорить больше, чем я. Я бы хотел сразу начать с Джей, с этой замечательной книжки, которая вышла буквально несколько дней назад, и начать с собственного воспоминания. Дело в том, что я, когда еще был довольно юн, в ранних своих тинейджерских годах, я обратил внимание, что люди вокруг меня используют какую-то странную формулу, которая часто повторяется. О каких-то людях, которые явно не приехали из-за границы, они говорили: «А, это французы». Или, что еще абсурднее, она из парикмахеров. И мне этот код, очевидно, что это был код, казался абсолютно неразгадываемым ребусом, пока я не сложил дважды два и не понял, что эти люди, евреи, так называют других евреев в обществе. Что они не могут произнести имя еврей, слово еврей. И таким образом, несмотря на то, что критика называет Джей антиутопию, для нас это в определенном смысле, по крайней мере, наше прошлое. Я бы хотел спросить у Говарда, имел ли он в виду что-то такое, знает ли он, что мы уже жили в антиутопии?
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for coming. Yes, I think altogether a dystopia is a false phrase, really, because when you are writing about the future, you are always writing about the present, because why would you bother otherwise? But also you are writing about the past. And I was very consciously writing about the past too. The father of the hero of Jay tells his son, the son remembers that when he was growing up, his father said, "You never used the letter J without putting two fingers over your mouth." So sometimes the book is published J with two lines across, almost like a cello or something. Keep silent. My father never made me do that, but we were brought up to be very quiet about being Jewish. Don't talk about it too much. There was a phrase, "stay stumm." About being Jewish, stay stumm. You don't need to tell people. They will know anyway. When they look at you, they'll know you are Jewish, but you don't need to tell them. So, stumm. And he was really also talking about his past, because at this time, so I'm talking about the 1950s, let's say, in the north of England, there was no real imminent danger. We were not in danger. But he remembered danger. He himself had not seen much danger. He'd fought in the army, but he'd not come to fight in Europe. He'd stayed at home. He'd not seen danger. He'd not seen danger to Jews, but he was aware of danger to Jews. But he had heard from his father, who was born in Ukraine, in Kamenets-Podolsky, had come over and no doubt told him stories about pogroms and so on. So for my father in the 1940s and 50s, to be Jewish was to carry a memory of the danger of being Jewish. Hence, stumm. So when you say this dystopian future is in fact your past, I completely understand. But isn't it true to say for Jews that for Jews there is no past, present and future? We live all those tenses at the same time. We commemorate our past, we remember our past, sometimes obsessively, someone would say, but we live forever in the past as vividly as though it's now. And I don't think we suppose that our future will really be substantially any different from the past. We have a different sense of the tenses. That's one of the things that being Jewish means, I think. That's the long answer to your question. The short answer to your question is yes.
Ну, раз вы заговорили о временном безвременье и вне времени, я бы хотел вот что спросить. За 5 лет, прошедших после написания этой книги, изменилось ли что-то, тем не менее, в этих ощущениях? Вот сегодня в Англии опубликованы результаты опроса британских евреев, которым был задан такой вопрос. Что бы они предпочли? Брексит без соглашения или правительство Джереми Корбина? И 78% британских евреев предпочли бы Брексит, при том, что 57% предпочитают, чтобы Брексита не было. Вы в какой группе?
I'm one of those that doesn't want Brexit to happen, and I do not want a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government. So we pray for some strange thing to happen that will stop Brexit and stop Jeremy Corbyn. But we don't know what that is. But wherever my Jewish friends meet, this is the first thing we say. We say, so, Brexit or Corbyn? Brexit or Corbyn? And we live in fear of it. We live in fear of we don't live in fear of Brexit. Brexit will not be a personal danger to us. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party might be personal danger to us, but we don't know how. We only know that a Brexit government will be a government which is hostile to Jews in ways it does not even understand. The hostility to Jews goes so deep that when they deny it, they might actually genuinely not know that they are hostile to Jews. So in the end, Brexit. I should say, can I just say, reading Jay again, as I have, coming here, it strikes me that it almost is a Brexit novel. I'm surprised how, if I were to write a novel about Brexit, how many of these things would be in it. Because the thing that this novel most fears, and the thing that Brexit makes one most fear, is the power of the people. Each one person, this is an exaggeration, but let's say each one person is God's creature and has many, many virtues, many beauties. Put that one person with another person, and suddenly that person is not so beautiful and not so trustworthy. Put 3 people together and the world becomes no longer paradisal but hellish. It was 3 people together, 300 people together, 3 million people together that made Brexit so terrible. You cannot trust 3 people, let alone 300,000 people. And that's also what made the thing that happened in Jay. This book is inspired by, and my fear of Brexit is inspired by, a real terror of the mob. A word you were not allowed to use in my country. You dare not say the mob because the people are sacrosanct. But those of us who have suffered from the mob, or if not personally, who remember suffering from the mob, know what a mob is. One other thing I will say, you asked me if things had changed since I wrote this, 4 or 5 years ago. Yes, and I think they are worse. I think for Jews they are worse. Particularly in British universities. British universities are, almost all of them, hotbeds of anti-Zionism, which very quickly becomes anti-Semitism. There was a paper published only 3 weeks ago by a union, by a university trade union. It was a university trade union representing polytechnics and technical colleges. And it produced a paper on the Holocaust. And it said the following people were the victims of the Holocaust: gypsies, Romanis, homosexuals, people with mental illnesses, political undesirables, and so on and so on and so on. All these people were the victims of the Holocaust. They left out something. They left out the Jew. Of all things, there are many things you might... Yeah, exactly. So here it is. They left the Jew out. They made the Jew invisible. They made the Jew go away.
У меня просто записка на манжетах. Так случилось, что вы упомянули политехнический институт, и я не мог не вспомнить вашу довольно скандальную статью в Independent, где вы вспоминали, что все знакомые вам, если так можно сказать, террористы, не заканчивали школу искусства, все имеют образование университетское в политехнических областях. Вы продолжаете так считать?
That was a joke.
I see.
Joke. All words with
it
the
wasn't
J.
too
Joke.
British. It wasn't too British. We understand.
Это была шутка.
Someone had done some research and they had discovered that where proven terrorists had done degrees at British institutions, they'd mainly done mechanical engineering. I like to think that if you go to university and study, say, literature, you will never be a terrorist. I have said no terrorist has yet been found carrying a copy of Middlemarch. And that was true 10 years ago, and it's true as far as I know today. But I now realize, I now realize this moment, this could be because the author of Middlemarch, George Eliot, was a Zionist.
Ну, возможно, потому что я раньше об этом не думала, только что пришло в голову, что Джордж Эллиот, автор этой книги, она была сионистом.
Don't look so surprised, she was.
Да, она была сионисткой.
Ну, чтобы закончить актуальную тематику, которая, конечно, далеко не самая интересная, но самая беспокоящая, я бы хотел спросить вот что. В прошлом году случилось беспрецедентное событие в истории английской, британской еврейской прессы. Все британские еврейские газеты вышли с одинаковой передовицей, говорящей о угрозе существования евреям Великобритании в лице Корбина. Не считаете ли вы, что это несколько излишняя паника и что повод все-таки не столь страшен, что угрозе существования, эссенциальной угрозе не существует?
Do I think it's overblown? No. I've never met Corbyn, but I feel I know Corbyn. I have studied Corbyn from television. And I'm very interested in what happens to Corbyn's face when someone says the word Jew. It goes like that. It turns away from the word Jew, as though the word Jew is too painful for his full face to take, so he has to receive it on the cheek. Now, I'm a novelist, so my world is not fact. My world is imagination and supposition, and when a person turns away from the word Jew, that tells me something. You can tell them that. There was an event recently, a mural, a great big mural, great big painting, appeared on a wall in East London. It showed 6 or 8 capitalists sitting around a table, a glass table that was positioned on the backs of the world's suffering, mainly black people, slaves, the suffering poor, and these capitalists were playing Monopoly. Okay, so the politics, it's easy to understand. Every one of these had a Jewish face. They looked more Jewish even than you and I do.
Cannot be.
Hard as that might be to believe. In fact, they look rather like you and I, actually. The local council decided that this was an offensive mural and made plans to remove it. Jeremy Corbyn said no. It's a lovely mural. It shows rich people oppressing poor people. And when somebody said it's anti-Semitism, it's anti-Semitic, he said, I don't see that. Where? And this was very, very interesting because some people thought this was Jeremy Corbyn being hypocritical or dishonest. I should say that the mural came down, and Jeremy Corbyn has since said, well, I just didn't notice. I mean, the idea that it was as big as this wall, you couldn't not notice the faces of 8 obviously Jewish capitalists oppressing the world. You couldn't not notice. But the reason, it's just possible that he didn't realize there was anything wrong, because he saw in that mural what is inside his head. That is what the world looks like. The world to Jeremy Corbyn looks like that. Capitalists oppressing poor people, and all the capitalists happen to be Jews. Now, partly I'm in Moscow, and it's partly, if I may put it like this, your fault that Jeremy Corbyn thinks like this, because Jeremy Corbyn read many, many books. Jeremy Corbyn was, when was he born? He was born in the 1940 or later than 1945 or 46. But the books that he read would have told him about Marxism. He is steeped in Marxism. And Marxism had different phases. But the phase of Marxism he most got on with was the phase of Marxism that said Jewish capitalism runs the world, Jews run the world through money, their money makes them all powerful, and they mean to scheme to control the world. There was also a phase of Marxism. Marxism sometimes liked Israel, sometimes disliked Israel. There was a phase of Marxism when they hated Israel. Corbyn also gets that bit of Marxism. So a lot of it comes from, a lot of Corbyn's ideology of today is in fact Russian ideology of the 1930s. So I blame you.
Marx was German. Marx was German.
Yeah, but by the time, it wasn't the Germans that took it up.
Мы не будем бояться сегодня произносить слово на Джей, и не будем уклоняться лицом от произнесения этого имени. Вы в одной из своих книг писали, что в детстве вы подозревали, что вы подкидыш. Настолько вы не чувствовали себя евреем. Что довольно сложно, учитывая ваши воспоминания о внешности, но тем не менее вам это удавалось. А потом у вас этот интерес проснулся настолько, что несколько напугал вашего отца, поскольку он вас просил, не собираетесь ли вы стать раввином и надевать тфилин. И вы его успокоили, но через 3 недели после его смерти тфилин надели. Это был последний раз?
Yes. And it will stay the last time.
That's a hope.
Once was good.
Почему? Почему тогда это было? Почему это вам было важно?
Because he would have liked it. But he would have liked it once. He too. My father belonged to a Jewish world which has gone now, I think. And looking back on it, I think it was a rather wonderful world of an intense consciousness of Jewishness, but not religious Jewishness. My father was frightened of synagogues. He wanted me to have a bar mitzvah. I had a bar mitzvah. But he didn't know what else Jewishness was, really. He didn't want me to marry a non-Jewish woman. And I would say, well, why don't you want me to marry a non-Jewish woman? He would say, because it's not Jewish. It's not good for Jews. And I would say, well, what is Jewishness then? And he'd think and he'd say, Jewishness is not marrying a Jewish woman. So what I did do is, at that time I was a young man and I married a half Jewish woman, and he was half pleased. Yes, and he was half pleased. I mean, and I've now, because I owe it as a novelist, I owe things to my readers. I later on, I'm not here to tell you the story of my life, but this much I will tell you. I then later on married an entirely non-Jewish woman. And now I'm married to an entirely Jewish woman. So I have tried the various things, and I can report, I may have been fortunate, but I can report, for me anyway, it's better being married to a Jewish woman. My father was right.
И мне вспоминается ваша встреча на радио, если я с знаменитым английским раввином, где вы были представлены антитезой ему, ассимилированным евреем, что вас возмутило. И как вы отвечаете сейчас на этот вопрос, что значит быть евреем, если вас возмущает то, что если вас называют ассимилированным евреем?
Are you saying that Jonathan Sacks insulted
Jay.
me? Jonathan, are you saying he insulted me or that I felt
Called
it?
assimilated, yeah. Why it's bothering you that he called you assimilated Jew?
Why did it bother me? I don't remember that it bothered me. I remember the conversation with Sacks. I had many conversations with Sacks. He was my friend. In fact, when I got married to my Jewish wife, Jonathan Sacks married us. And many of my friends who don't think of me as a practicing or religious Jew, and I'm not a practicing Jew in that sense, couldn't understand why would I want the chief rabbi to marry me. And they worried, my non-religious friends, Jewish and not Jewish, worried that I was suddenly becoming religious and therefore being lost to the world of free thinking in which we glory in my world. And I said I wanted to get married is a serious thing, and I wanted the language of grandeur. I would want to be buried by a rabbi. A rabbi officiated at my bar mitzvah and one or two other things as well. And I would want the language of grandeur. And the truth is, you turn to, I have no difficulty with this, you may think it's hypocritical. I don't think it's hypocritical. You turn to religion when you need it. We turn to most things when we need it, and you need religion at those great moments, and that's what makes religion important to me. But it's a language thing, and Sacks was a good speaker, and I knew that when Sacks married us, he would marry us with great dignity, instead of some of the marriages which I see sometimes, which are kind of people turn up in jeans and they sing some folk songs, or people even die. So you probably don't have the song "Always Look on the Bright Side." You have "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life." Do you know that song from Monty Python? Mm-hmm. I've been to 3 funerals in the last year in which people sing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life." I would want Bach. I would even want a Christian. I would want a Jewish burial, but maybe not the Messiah, but maybe the St. Matthew Passion playing, the language of all the religions available for the great moments in your life. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Jonathan Sacks and I used to read, and still do read, I think, each other's books. And we respect each other's books. And we argue, and I've not seen him for a while, but while he was chief rabbi, we did argue all the time about this simple thing: what is it to be a Jew? And for him, when he called me an assimilated Jew, he sort of meant I wasn't Jewish enough. And my answer to him sometimes was, "Rabbi, you were a great rabbinic scholar, but you're not Jewish enough." And the reason, and he did once say to me, what was meant to be a compliment, I think, he did once say to me, "You'd have been a better rabbi than I would have been." So I said, "Fix it," because I would have enjoyed it, I think. But the argument was, what makes a Jew? And I said, you probably wake up every morning thinking about things Jewish, and you go to bed every night thinking about things Jewish. So do I. But the difference between us is I believe that the heart of Judaism is the joy of arguing with everybody actually, but arguing certainly with other Jews about what being Jewish is. You must never know. You must never have made your mind up. If you've made your mind up, Rabbi, what being Jewish is, you've ceased to be Jewish, because the joy of being Jewish is that you don't know. And it goes on and on and on, that argument. We are a disputatious people. That's why we make good lawyers, but it's not only that kind of disputatiousness. We argue with God. We are probably the only truly religious people who argue with God. God, you're wrong. Now, I think I've told God he's wrong more often than Jonathan Sacks.
That's why I'm not Jewish.
Exactly.
Русскоязычный читатель сможет в этом скоро убедиться, потому что Джей мы уже издали. Следующая книга, которую мы сделаем, это книга Джонатана Сакса. И можно посмотреть. Мне-то кажется, по прочтению этих книг, что наш сегодняшний спикер и Джонатан Сакс похожи в своем ходе мысли гораздо чаще и больше, чем кажется обоим. И, например, в своем довольно однозначном, и я бы сказал, слишком однозначном для Израиля и для американского еврейства отношения к движению BDS, бойкотированию и санкционированию Израиля, и вообще в отношении к Израилю. Оно у вас гораздо более однозначное, чем у ваших единомышленников, как казалось бы, по другую сторону океана. И мне кажется, что что-то с вами произошло, потому что в документальном фильме BBC много лет назад вы рассказывали о своей поездке в Израиль. Вам, кажется, понравился только кибуц. Митци там такой вам понравился. С этого времени что-то изменилось, потому что вряд ли люди из кибуца разделяют ваши сегодняшние взгляды.
I wrote a book called Roots Schmutz.
I read this book last one, that's why I'm...
And it's funny, I began the journey. It was a Jewish journey around England, and then I went to America, and I went to Israel for the first time, and went to many places in Europe, discovering really what's being Jew. But the first thing that happened when I set off on that journey was I had a debate at the BBC studios with Jonathan Sacks. And that was the first time we actually met. And our argument set me off on my journey. There was strange criticism from Jews about the Israeli section in that film. I don't know why. I don't think my opinion has changed. I listened to some people who said unreasonable things. I listened to some Jews in Israel who said I thought violently unreasonable things and said so. That's anybody's duty. That's a Jew's duty to say so. I met some Jews I admired. I met some Jews I didn't admire. But there was criticism of me, though, particularly in America, because it felt if I was in Israel, I mustn't say a word against Israel. I think you make a better argument for the importance of Israel as for the importance of anything else. If you see where the problems might lay, if you show that you understand somebody else's objections. I remember my mother-in-law objected to the film I made about Israel because she didn't think that they looked beautiful enough. She said, "Why did you find not very nice-looking Israelis all the time?" She felt there should have been more beauty. I thought we met some very nice-looking Israelis afterwards. But I don't think there has been any change in my viewpoint at all. I saw some things that I thought were shocking about Israeli society. If I went back now, I'm sure I would see some things that are shocking about Israeli society. But that's a long way from believing in boycotting. I would never have believed, I never ever did believe in boycotting. And I never believed that there was anything evil in Zionism. I'm not a Zionist. Because I'm not an anything-ist, I'm a novelist. That's the only ist I'm allowed. And a novelist must not be any other kind of ist, that's sacred. But nonetheless, I admire Zionism. I know what Zionism is for. I think it's very important. And I read, coming out of British universities and British newspapers, gross caricatures of what Zionism is, a misunderstanding of what Zionism is, a very gross misunderstanding of what Zionism is, and I say so. And as far as I know, I said so in the film, too.
That is nothing changed. Okay.
Sorry, that's a lot. Cut it down if you like. You're looking as though this is making you tired.
I'm forgetting everything now, even more. Thank you for your concern. Много лет назад я выпустил фильм, который
I'll show you the book while you're finding the words, because you should see the book. It's a lovely cover of this book because it's brilliant actually. Because the letter J is kind of, what do you call that thing when it's kind of just raised a little? But it's in a marvelous ghostly white, so it actually vanishes. So according to how you hold the book, the Jews appear and the Jews vanish again. the book enacts the meaning of its.
Я бы хотел до свободной беседы, которая гораздо интереснее моих политизированных вопросов, задать некоторую версию самого идиотского вопроса, который задают писателям, на чем вы сейчас работаете. Я, учитывая ваш несомненный правительский дар в Джей, о котором даже вы обмолвились, хочу спросить, что будет дальше с евреями Европы и Соединенных Штатов Америки, по-вашему? Кажется ли вам, что это будущее растворение, как эта буква на этой обложке? И существует ли угроза по обе стороны океана? И действительно ли Израиль является единственным естественным выходом для продолжения существования еврейского народа как народа?
I am a novelist, not a prophet.
I started from that you're a prophet.
Yes. We always used to be told. Start again. When I said to some people, Israel is very important to Jews, whatever kind of Jew they are, because it's a lifeboat. That was the old argument, was my father's argument. Whatever you think about Israel, we will one day need Israel to save us, possibly. And then people said, we don't need Israel anymore, we've got America. America will save us. It's now impossible to believe that America will definitely save the Jews. The most frightening thing for Jews in the last few years is the rise of anti-Semitism in America. England, we leave. France, we leave. But America is one of the places we would leave to. And that makes it very, very frightening. And that makes Israel even more important to Jews, I think. I don't think assimilation is the danger. I think probably there will be less assimilation, because anti-Semitism, one of the effects of anti-Semitism is to make Jews even more than usually conscious of their Jewishness. I think Jews will go on being very conscious of their Jewishness. The only problem is, where will they practice it? Where will they be Jewish safely? And it's very hard to say. And if not Israel in the next 10 years, where? I still think it's safe. I find England safe. I feel safe in England. I shouldn't say that because I might get attacked the minute I go home. But I feel safe in England. But there are question marks. What will happen if we get a Labour Party in England? How safe will we feel? I don't know. No Jews do. But all the Jews I know who say they are not feeling safe in England say if there is a Labour Party, they will go to Israel. Israel is not a very big country. How many Jews can Israel take?
Окей, дорогие друзья, я свою программу выполнил, все свои вопросы я задал. Книжку я читал, вы прочитаете потом. Те, кто не прочитал, можете сегодня получить автограф у автора. Но я думаю, что мы позволим задать несколько вопросов. И поверьте, это уникальная возможность.
Добрый вечер, меня зовут мистер Говард Джейкобсон. Я студент 4-го курса Еврейского университета кампуса Отрадное. Что бы вы, как преподаватель Кембриджского университета, посоветовали мне и моим однокурсникам, то есть тем, кто в этом году завершает свое обучение, что делать и что, на ваш взгляд, может помочь стать успешным? Это первый вопрос. Второй вопрос. Какие книги вы бы посоветовали прочитать мне как программисту? И третий вопрос. На момент вручения вам Букеровской премии вы стали старейшим лауреатом со временем присуждения премии Уильяму Голдингу в 1980 году. А вопрос Финклера первым юмористическим романом-победителем за всю 42-летнюю историю премии. Как вы думаете, эти факты взаимосвязаны? Можно ли сказать, что только достигнув определенного уровня зрелости, можно научиться относиться к жизни с юмором?
How long have we got now?
All the time is yours.
One, find yourself a partner. A man or a woman that you love. One. Two, what book should you read? Well, read everything, really. But if you can't read everything and you're just finishing Jewish studies, and I don't know what that implies, I hope that you read the great books by Jewish humorists like Isaac Bashevis Singer, like Philip Roth, like Saul Bellow, like Bernard Malamud, like me. Read us. Give the next 5 years to reading us, aloud to your partner. You will be, and that will make you very happy. Laugh, because Jews are wonderful comedians. Jews make the best jokes in the world, so laugh. A Jew has an obligation, has he not? A Jew has an obligation to laughter. So make sure you laugh. Don't worry too much. Be happy. Read Jewish books by funny authors, particularly by me. And then there was something else. I was old when I won the Booker Prize. I should, of course, have won the Booker Prize many years before that. But the Booker Prize the Booker Prize is rarely given to books that make people laugh. The minute serious critics read a book that makes them laugh, they think it can't be a serious book. So you are at a disadvantage if you make people laugh. It wasn't that I was of a particular age to be ready for the prize. It was that the prize was a particular age. The Booker Prize matured and finally was ready for me. It then failed again 4 years later, when although Jay was shortlisted, it didn't win the prize. And that made me think maybe the Booker Prize has fallen backwards again.
But that was just not funny enough. They've already got the tape.
You think I should have done a funnier version of Jay? Okay. I still think it should have won the book, but I still think. And then come and see me in 5 years and tell me how it's all going.
How did you come up with this gesture of throwing books?
No. I don't know. I was thinking about my own father and telling me to be shh, and that is a kind of physical manifestation of shh. That's shh, shtum, shh, and that is super shtum. Yeah. 1 finger is enough, 2 fingers is even better.
Я уже 2-й день наслаждаюсь вашими лекциями. Честно говоря, не знал, что задам этот вопрос, поэтому может потребоваться мне какое-то время, чтобы его сформулировать. Я пришел сюда вообще-то от школы современной литературы, хотя я сам не писатель, но вы вчера рассказывали про вашу книгу, про Джей, и у меня застрял на самом деле в голове такой же вопрос, который сегодня задал ваш собеседник. Первый вопрос о том, что в России мы действительно имеем то апокалиптическое будущее, которое вы описываете, и это для нас настоящее. И оно мне наложилось в голове. Я просто вчера спрашивал, что еще я смогу найти в этой книге, если я не хочу видеть мир без евреев. Я думал вот об этих 2 вещах, потому что еще мои преподаватели, они сказали, что мы будем вас учить работать в условиях катастрофы. И это, опять же, коррелирует с тем, что действительно, не только в России, я думаю, что во многих странах сейчас мы наблюдаем эту глобальную катастрофу, которая, может быть, касается не только евреев. Я на самом деле, когда вы сказали, что это вы виноваты, у меня возникло такое воспоминание. Я наполовину грузин, и я был в Грузии в 2010 году, через пару лет после войны. И я тогда очень остро ощутил вот это вот, то, что вот эту вот фразу, которую вы сказали, что это вы виноваты. И тогда то, о чем вы говорили, это относилось, наверное, к более старшему поколению, да, но в моем случае это вина за мое личное бездействие в тот момент. И сегодня как бы вопрос, который я хочу на самом деле задать, это как изменить мир, да? Я надеюсь, я найду ответ в книге в Джей, но пользуясь возможностью, хотелось бы задать его вам напрямую.
How to change the world. Do you know I don't know how to change the world? And I'm not sure that the best literature ever does tell you how to change the world. All you can ever do is understand the world. You can understand the world. You can understand what makes human beings do what they do to one another. I'm not sure that you can change them. Some of the books I most like are written in times of enormous upheaval and catastrophe, and you wouldn't know that from the books. It's one of the things I love about literature, that you wouldn't always know what catastrophic things are happening around them. So, one of my favourite writers, Jane Austen, writes love stories. The Napoleonic Wars have been raging, there's a slave trade going on, Britain is making its money out of imperialism and colonialism, and Jane Austen writes these stories about, will she fall in love with him, will he fall in love with her, and you know, nothing, when you are reading those books, nothing matters more. Even when I know, I read some of those novels again and again, Pride and Prejudice, I know what's going to happen. I know it will be okay, but I still read with trembling in case she doesn't get him and he doesn't get her. I think this is one of the wonderful things that literature does. It's not escapism, it isn't that, it's just twisting a little how your mind looks at the world. There's a famous poem by Thomas Hardy, just about four lines long, and he just looks at a poor person walking through a field with a girl. And he just says, their story, I can't remember the lines now, their story will go on forever, though, and then I've forgotten the next line, though wars come and wars happen. The eternalities are much more about, will he fall in love with her and will she fall in love with him? So how to save the world is to read love stories by very great writers. That's all I have to say. When Tolstoy was an old man, he read Anna Karenina again and was ashamed of it. And he said, why did I write that rubbish? That rubbish about this rich woman from St. Petersburg, if that's right, who falls in love with a cavalry officer, and it's just this story of rich people who lead worthless lives. Why did I write that? What he was writing at the time he said those words was pamphlets about how the world could change itself, Christian pamphlets and so on. What do we read? We don't read those pamphlets. We read what he thought was rubbish.
Да, пожалуйста.
Безумно приятно вас видеть и слушать сегодня. У меня будет очень короткий вопрос. Есть ли у вас в планах получить еще и Нобелевскую премию по литературе?
Я бы сказал, достаточно ли она повзрослела?
No, the Nobel Prize has not matured enough. He gave it to Bob Dylan recently.
Это Нобелевская премия достаточно повзрослела. Ее вручили Бобу Дилану.
There is a story, I don't know if it's true, but there was a novel published a couple of years ago by a woman who was, I think, the girlfriend, the lover of Philip Roth. And she says that every year that the Nobel Prize was about to be announced, Philip Roth waited by the phone to hear. Except we all know he was never going to win the Nobel Prize because he had the wrong attitudes to Israel. I have the wrong attitudes to Israel. I'm never going to win the Nobel Prize, and I don't sit waiting by the phone. But just in case we do, just in case I do, my wife finds out when the Nobel Prize is going to be announced and takes me for a long dinner and gets me drunk. No. Nice of you to ask now.
Здравствуйте, очень рад вас видеть. Я студент первого курса Еврейского университета кампус Отрадное, но мой вопрос будет не про учебу, мой вопрос будет про наше любимое искусство. Мне очень интересно знать, есть ли у вас какие-то музыкальные альбомы или исполнители, которых вы можете слушать на протяжении десятилетий, и что бы вы могли посоветовать нам, молодым людям, чтобы послушать, и, может быть, вы что-то слушаете в данный момент, чем вы могли бы с нами поделиться. Это очень интересно для меня.
When I was a young man, my brother played the guitar and was in a group. And the group was quite well known in Manchester and then disbanded. And then some of the members of the group went on to form another group. My brother left, but they played in my front room because they were all local Jewish boys. And then they became, I don't know, you might be too young to remember this, but there was a very famous group called 10cc. Do any of you know who 10cc was? A very famous group. They wrote a wonderful song called I'm Not in Love, which was a song that all 17-year-old boys danced very slowly with their girlfriends too. And this was the group. My brother left, but this was the group that practiced in my house. And I said, "You're rubbish. You're rubbish. You will come to nothing. You've no idea. You've no musical talent whatsoever." I had another friend who was a manager of very small pop groups. And one day he said, "Come out with me. I'm listening to a particular group. They've just come from Liverpool. This was in Manchester. Come out with me and see what you think." And we went, and he said, "What do you think?" I said, "Rubbish. Absolute rubbish." They were the Beatles. So I'm not really very well positioned to comment on popular music. And I'm much more kind of conservative, really. If I want to play music that will make me feel the way I want to feel, I play on tape. I play Schubert, I play Winterreise, or I play Bach, or I play Mozart, or I go to the opera to Puccini or Verdi. I like to cry to Verdi. When I was a boy, I used to put on opera in my room, and it was always operas that made me cry. Went into my bedroom, turned the lights off, put on La Traviata or Tosca, and cried. My parents got very worried about me because they could just hear sounds from my bedroom of crying all the time. So my musical passions are serious and highly emotional and very, very melancholy. Schubert impromptus played by a great pianist. The Schubert impromptus are the most wonderful things on earth. Or a great singer, Fischer Dieskau, singing Winterreise. That's it for me. Not 10cc or the Beatles. Sorry, and I should have said Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich.
Можем спросить про советы, какие картины посмотреть. Главное, какое кино. Главное, не останавливайте это. Окей. Да, пожалуйста, даже второй вопрос мы дадим.
Да. Буду так нескромен, что задам еще один вопрос. На самом деле, у меня еще один интерес. Я читал про вашего брата, что он занимается музыкой. И мне интересно, повлияло ли как-то это на ваше творчество? У меня есть такая мысль, что сегодня, ну и вообще, что любое талантливое искусство, оно старается максимально вбирать в себя что-то из своих сестер. Там, ну, живопись все там берет из музыки, литературы, соответственно, я думаю, берет из всего. Но мне интересно, как это работает, ну, как это сработало в вашем случае, если это так, если можно так выразиться.
I think my brother is now a painter. So this makes your argument. But he was a serious painter before he was a musician. And I think he was a painter to escape the noise in my house. We had a very, very, very noisy house. My father was a very noisy man. He came from Kamenets-Podolsky. He looked like a Russian. Had there been bears in Manchester, my father would have danced with bears. He was that kind of a man. My mother was very quiet, but on the other hand, she argued with my father about things. It was my father had lots of friends around. It was a very noisy house. And the children, we all tried to escape, to make some escape. And my brother painted to escape from the noise in the house. He would sit very, very quietly and just paint and paint. And all his paintings now have no people in them. They are landscape. He has painted people for people. He's painted people out of the world. He's escaped. He didn't lack he was a perfectly happy, well-regulated man, but he wanted people out of the world. And I think my writing, where I write very, very highly organized, stylistic sentences that sometimes sound more 18th century than sound modern, more like Jane Austen. My sentences are more like Jane Austen sentences than they are Philip Roth's sentences. And I think in my own way, I was trying to make my world, my disordered, chaotic Jewish world in which I grew up, ordered. So I was ordering and my brother was emptying. There was also my sister who could have been a painter, but because she was a girl, was not encouraged to be a painter. But she then became the very noisy person we were escaping from. So this really was art to try and make an order out of chaos. And only really late in my life as a writer, did I realize I was very lucky to have that chaos. And then I tried to bring the chaos back into the world that I'd emptied it from. I used to think, sorry, I'm talking an awfully long time. Don't translate this, they get it or they don't. I used to envy people whose fathers were professors or philosophers. I used to particularly envy the novelist Martin Amis, who you may have heard of, who had a well-known father who was a novelist, Kingsley Amis. And I imagined that Martin Amis would go into his father's study and they would talk about novels together. And Martin Amis would say, "Father," he called him Father, "Father, look what I have just written." And Kingsley Amis would say, "My son, that's a wonderful thing you have just written." In real life, Kingsley Amis wouldn't read a word that his son had written. They were jealous of each other, they fought, they did not help each other in that way. Exactly. But that was what I dreamed would be wonderful. But I had this kind of Russian bear-loving Kamenets-Podolsky father who was also a magician. He did tricks. I would bring my friends round from school and he would take an egg out of their ear and I'd go, "No, don't do all that." He wasn't the elegant, demure, quiet father I thought I wanted. And only after he died and I matured a little bit did I realize how lucky I was to have that noise. So I don't know about whether the arts infected one another, but certainly the world in which we lived, which was not an artistic world, and you would think did not make for art, in a very strange way, did encourage art, by virtue of opposites, if you like. Don't translate that.
By the way, my roots is from Kamenets-Podolsky J.
Really?
My father's fantastic. My
Моя
grandfather.
мама была очень тихой, но с другой стороны она все время ругалась с папой. Кроме того, все время приводил домой шумных друзей. И, в общем,
Can I use my prerogative as a roving mic person to ask a question? It's a two-step one. Firstly, it's interesting that you choose St. Matthew's Passion there when you were talking about your own funeral, because I think it appears in Jay. It's one of the things that the father keeps still listening to, I think. And also, interestingly enough, it appears in Philippe Sand's East-West Street, because that's the thing that Hans Frank listened to, the only thing he listened to in prison. It's the book we'll be publishing, but it's interesting that a convicted Nazi would choose that particular thing to listen over and over and over again to. I am completely ignorant in classical music, so firstly, could you explain what it is particularly about that piece that strikes you? And also the second part of the question is that I'm sorry to bring the conversation back to Shylock, but there Shylock is kind of disconcerted by the arts collection that Strulevich has, because he says that Jews don't need art because God did not paint the world into being. He spoke it into being. So if we kind of try to pick your brain through that quote, we may think that you're not a particular fan of arts in general, apart from literature. But then it seems that you go for emotion, you do go to music. Would that be true? And what particular emotion does St. Matthew's Passion evoke?
Okay, so Matthew, Bach does the poignancy of the end of life greater than anybody else. The music is I can't describe musically how it does it, but it is unbearable to listen to. There's another Bach, there's a Bach cantata, which probably is my favorite piece of music, and the German is Ich habe genug, how you all might be feeling right this minute. And it's the feeling that you've reached the end of your life now and there is only death, and it's about fearing death, welcoming death, and there being nothing but death then. And the poignancy of that, nobody, I think, evokes that like Bach. But more importantly, what you're the conversation in Shylock about art is to do with this, and I'm very interested in the commandment. One of the 10 great commandments is you don't make graven images. Quite what we mean by a graven image, we can argue about, but that has been taken to mean over many generations by many Jews as art. You shall not make art, because in the making of art you are rivaling the Almighty. The Almighty made the world and all its objects and people and nature, and when you try to people a new world, you are rivaling, you are questioning the Almighty. It's a blasphemy. This resulted, and the Muslim world has something similar. This resulted in an austerity for many centuries in Jewish art. If you think of the plainness of so many synagogues compared to the extravagance of so many churches, we don't have, when you think of, most Jews, when they see the Christian iconography of Jesus on a cross and thing, they can't. It's too gaudy for them. It's too crude for them. It's not what we do. And one of the reasons we don't do it is that, well, either we don't do it because of that commandment, or because of our distaste for that kind of gaudiness, we came up with that commandment. But I think the consequence of this is that Jewish artists have fought against it, and they have made art, but they make art and they are consciously disobeying God. So the art that they make is so often profane. The Jews have, Philip Roth is a very good case in point. I think every time Philip Roth starts to write a novel, he's fighting with God, he's abusing God. I feel it a bit, but not the degree to which, say, Philip Roth does. Some artists more than others. But I feel when I make art, I am rivaling God, and that's a kind of wicked thing to do. And there is an excitement in that, and there's a thrill in that. And it makes art a very, very important thing that you're doing, a very shocking thing that you're doing. And I think that's why there is this strong connection between Jews and art. Forbid people to do something and they will do it. There is nothing like a commandment to excite people. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Think of the effect that had. Think of the amount of adultery that would not have been in the world had God said, don't do it. Had God said, thou shalt commit adultery, how much adultery would there have been? So I think this gives to Jewish art, and that's the conversation that I was meaning to have anyway in Shylock, this gives a special frisson to Jewish art. They understood and a miracle happens. A miracle happens. If an author goes on talking to a room, even if they don't speak his language, they understand. They come to understand. Everybody in this room understands what I'm saying.
Definitely. But still,
But still you want to persist.
I have to.
Okay.
Bach.
And now we must be ready to talk about Jay.
Exactly.
Let's start. Surely we're finished, aren't we? We're finished now. Oh, okay.
Мы оставляем 2 вопроса еще и отпускаем.
Исходя из предыдущего вопроса, есть ли у вас какая-нибудь коллекция произведений искусства и какая у вас есть отдушина в жизни на протяжении всей жизни, поддерживающая вас в самые трудные моменты? Спасибо.
Gives you support in difficult times of life.
Do I have a collection of art? No, but I have some pieces that I like, and I like to be surrounded by them. I like pictures on the walls, yes, but paintings I don't like, non-paintings. And what was the other question? What gives me?
Supports you, something that you have during your life that supports you during your life crisis, something that you vent or hobby.
I've just written a novel called, it's just come out in Britain, in England, called Live a Little, which I'm hoping very much I will be here talking about in Russian translation in a year or so. And it's about a love affair between 2 people who are very old. They are both 90. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to express their affection through talk. I wanted to see if I could make them convincingly fall in love through conversation. Not the body is now forgotten. Just conversation. Could they love each other through their words? And I think they do. I think it succeeds. And that's a way of answering your question. Conversation. I like talking to my friends. It's very, very important to me to talk to my wife. We talk and we talk and we talk and we talk. And words. Love and words which go together. You can express great love in words. You can have a love of words, a love of language, and you can express love in language. And I guess it's language. I do, as you've noticed, talk a lot. I like talking. I like writing. Mine is a life of words. I find anything else difficult, really. No, my life is entirely a life of words, a love for words and expressing love in words. And that's why I look so physically unhealthy.
С вашей точки зрения, какова роль литературы в современном обществе? Какова задача писателя? Развлечь читателя какой-то любовной историей, образовать его, направить на какой-то путь, задуматься о мире, о себе. Какая задача ваша как писателя? Представляете ли вы вашего читателя перед собой, когда вы к нему обращаетесь? Кто этот человек? Что вы хотите до него донести?
I write for me. I see no one else. I see only me. I am my ideal reader. If I laugh, I think the world will laugh. If I cry, I think the world will cry, and nobody else. I think writing has never been more important than it is now, because writing, imaginative writing, the world of the imagination, liberates us from the brutality of the way we are talking and thinking today. At any time, individuals speak brutally to one another and think brutally to one another in their ordinary daily life. It's literature helps you to raise yourself above everyday life while still celebrating it. It's not an escape from it, but it's a raising the level of it. If you think of what happens on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter, people are just saying what they're hitting one another with their opinions. Literature is an escape from opinions. I claim as a novelist I don't have opinions. As a novelist, I don't have opinions. I might have opinions here, talking to you when you ask my opinion, but they're not my opinions are not very interesting. None of our opinions are very interesting. We aren't, as human beings, interesting in our opinion. We know all this, we meet each other, we think, oh, that looks a fascinating person, and then we go out, we take that person for a meal, or we go to dinner, and we go, oh God, you think that, do you? Oh, and you believe that, do you? What a shame. Because we are at our worst when we are expressing our ordinary daily thought. The world of the imagination, I'm not saying it takes us away as in a balloon away, that's no good, but it just raises us. When you write a novel or a poem or you paint a painting, you don't know, if you're any good, you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what you think. When I write a novel, I don't know how it's going to end. I sometimes don't even know how it's going to begin. I don't know what's going to happen. Picasso always says, it's a wonderful thing. I start to paint a painting and it becomes something else. And it's because art becomes something else that it liberates us from the opposite to something else, which is the sameness. The sameness of, we can travel the world and we discover in all different kinds, we're still thinking the same boring things. But art is, it's not an escape from the real world, it's an enhancement of the real world. It's, instead of opinion, it gives us judgment, and more, and still better than in judgment, it gives us an imaginative. I'm now talking too much, and I'm getting tired. But it is that idea that we escape the mundanity, the ordinary, brutal, mundane nature of our world. And that's why at the worst of times we all somewhere love art. You all wouldn't be in this room unless you love art at some level. You might not like mine, but you wouldn't be here curious unless you loved art. And what you love about art is that it is of the world. It's not an escape from the world. It's not mysticism. Art is a celebration of life, but a celebration of life at its most surprising and at its very best. Something like that. They heard, they got that. They got that by the magical properties of language, of a writer's language. I make them understand. There's probably a fairy story about that, about how somebody who, yes, see, they understand. No, don't. It's cruel. It's cruel.
Do we need a translation? I think that's
Это надо спросить по-русски.
So that's the other thing a novelist does. He teaches you a language you didn't know you knew. And that is true in one way, that any good artist teaches you a language of the feelings that you don't know. You look at a really good painter, you look at Picasso or look at Rembrandt, and you come away spend 2 hours looking at Rembrandt, and you are not the person that went to look at Rembrandt. You are just different. You look at the human face differently. You see eyes differently. You are somebody else doing the feeling. Read a novel, read Tolstoy, read Anna Karenina. You are not the same person you were when you started reading. You did not know before you read Anna Karenina the depth of feeling that a person was capable of. But that's enough. I have to shut up. This is just ridiculous now. My wife is looking at me as though I'm mad.
She wants to talk with her.
She has to hear this every morning, of course. Every morning I say, would you like to know what art is, darling? And I tell her.
Я бы хотел сказать то, что не было переведено, и возразить этому, потому что Говард сказал, среди прочего, что литература и автор дает возможность уйти от мнения, потому что мы все имеем мнение, а у автора нет мнения. Он начинает писать книгу, не знает, чем она закончится, и не знает, как будут вести себя ее герои. И художник, подходя к картине, к Пикассо, не знал, что из нее получится. Задумывал одно, получалось другое. Потому что мнение никому не интересно. Но вот сегодня мы были свидетелями того, что писатель своим мнением интересен не менее своих книг. Надо согласиться с Говардом, что это редкое явление. Я как издатель подтверждаю. Но в данном случае это абсолютное исключение из правил. И пусть оно подтверждает правила, но я очень благодарен господину Джейкобсону за то, что он сегодня с нами поделился своими мнениями, которые были столь замечательные и столь интересны. Огромное спасибо.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. No, you look very tired. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Really nice. Thank you.
Автографы.